Okay, well, thank you for the invitation and the introduction. Those of you who know me know I am nowhere near as entertaining as Raed, so it's going to get a bit more boring, but let me go through. But one thing I should say at the outset is that we have, of course, been talking about this for a long time, so in that sense, I think we're quite consistent in terms of messages. So, how do we... So let me just briefly start with the context. I'm going to go and skip over some of my slides because Kathy and or Raed have already said them. But I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind in terms of the context is that we know not a whole lot has been achieved in this region in terms of formal integration and the visions that were set out in the 1960s. But I think the other thing to kind of reflect upon is that the rest of the world is to some extent converging on the MENA region in the sense that a lot of the regional integration initiatives that have been launched recently have ended up in failure, right? So we've had the TPP in the Trans-Pacific. We've had not a very happy experience with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And we have, of course, a new administration in the United States, which is not exactly pro-free trade. And we've not done all that well in the WTO either. So there is a bit of a trend here that's, is not particularly positive. I'm not going to dwell on this. Maybe we can come back to it in the question and answer session. But I think this context is important to keep in mind. At the same time, I would also stress that there are very strong reasons to also be positive, right? And I think one of the things that is striking about the current discussions and efforts at trade integration, whether it's regional or multilateral, is that a lot of the difficulty is still associated with liberalizing trade in goods. And meanwhile, kind of under the radar screen, there's been a huge amount of integration with respect to new technologies, with respect to trade and services, digital trade, and so forth. So this graph is just something I took from a recent Vox EU column, which looks at, what's been the rate of growth of data flows over the last few years. And the rate of expansion of that type of interaction is just, it's exponential, right? And underneath that, of course, is social media, but there's also a lot of electronic commerce going on there. There's a lot of digital trade going on, which is really happening kind of under the radar screen, which of course is affected by policy, does require a framework, but I think it's important to say and to realize there is that dimension as well as to what is going on. And I think these are all areas of great potential for the region, right? Not just for other countries in the rest of the world. The other thing I think to keep in mind, which is a positive, and Raed has already spoken about this, there are new forms of cooperation which have been working, right? So the traditional free trade agreement, customs union, common market type of an approach may not be going particularly fast in many parts of the world, including here. But at the same time, if you look at what has been happening in the WTO with the trade facilitation agreement, but also with so-called critical mass agreements where clubs of countries, groups of countries come together and say, we want to reduce tariffs on information technology goods, or we want to do something on environmentally related goods and services, and not everybody has to be part of this. It's basically the countries who want to join this, and as long as enough countries join those types of initiatives that you can address the free rider problem, cooperation actually does occur. So I think, again, all that to say, we shouldn't be too negative about the potential for cooperation. Now, I have slides here on constraints to regional integration and cooperation in the region. I'm going to skip over them, Raed has said it all. Similarly, I think it is important again to stress the positive. There are, of course, big opportunities here in terms of we have large markets in the region which have not been performing particularly well in recent years. We have large economies like Iran and Iraq, which historically have played an important role in terms of trade in the region, where we've seen very massive reductions in whatever indicator of global integration, economic integration you might use. So again, I think there's a lot of potential there. Kathy has talked about FDI. I think one of the things, again, the positive dimension of the FDI trends until the financial crisis hit is that they were increasing very fast. Since then, of course, they've dropped down dramatically. But again, it shows that there is potential to leverage these channels of economic activity. Now, I want to dwell very briefly on one of the kind of indicators that Kathy mentioned briefly, which is value chain participation. And as you all know, the way world production works nowadays, firms operate value chains and essentially they source from different parts of the world to create products that ultimately are consumed in end markets. And this is data that comes from the OECD. Kathy also briefly had one slide up that was drawn from this paper by the OECD staff. And essentially it looks at what's the import content of exports of countries. And what you find is that there's huge variance in terms of that performance indicator in terms of countries in this region, but a number of countries actually don't look that different from East Asia. So some countries have actually put in place policies to encourage this type of manufacturing, production, and trade. Right? And examples are Jordan, Turkey, Tunisia are the three that step out here. And what I have here on the right-hand side, I have Malaysia and Thailand just as comparator. Malaysia, of course, is much higher. But nonetheless, if you compare many of the countries, or the best performing countries on this indicator in the region with Thailand, we don't see that much of a difference. What is interesting in terms of the analysis that has been done to kind of figure out what determines the ability of countries and firms in countries to actually harness this technology of specializing in particular types of production and tasks to produce goods and services is that, maybe you can't see it in this graph very well, but if you look at the negative factors, trade policy here is a negative. So when you run regressions where you try to explain participation rates in value chains, trade policy, not surprisingly, is negative because that's a cost. But it's not a very big negative for many of the countries in the region. Investment is a positive. That's the foreign direct investment, are these purple bars. But the big thing that really explains participation rates are these red bars here, and these are essentially structural factors. And what are those factors? In part, it's infrastructure related, things that determine real trade costs, but a large part of it is also non-tariff measures, regulatory types of policies that apply at borders, right? And there's been a lot of work done at the ERF and in FEMIS trying to map these non-tariff measures. I don't know if Patricia's still here, who's done a lot of work on this particular area. So the implication of that is that if you really want to get into this diversification, do more of that, you really need to deal with these more structural features as opposed to just focusing on trade policy. One element of, and it's not really structural, but one element that plays a big role are services and services-related policies. Here, and here again, the stylized facts is that countries in the region tend to be relatively restricted with respect to trade in services and investment in services. But again, as you can see from this graph, there's huge heterogeneity across countries. And the countries that have done best in terms of value chain participation are the ones that have the lowest barriers to trade in services and the lowest barriers to investment in services. Right, and those countries include Morocco and Tunisia, and of course the UAE. I don't have the UAE in this graph, but that is one of those three. If you translate those barriers to trade in services into tariff equivalents, into ad valorem equivalents, those numbers often come up to be very, very high. Right, so we have a lot of restrictions on the things you actually need to make these supply chains work efficiently. If firms don't have access to those types of services, they're not going to come and invest, and the whole production chain breaks down. Now, one of the things that I've been doing research on in the last couple of years or so is to look at what is the implication of having high services barriers, high services trade barriers, on the productivity of manufacturing industries. Right? So the idea here is that manufacturing industries use a lot of services as inputs. If they don't have access to competitively priced inputs, if they don't have access to enough of the services inputs they need, they're going to be less competitive, and therefore they won't be able to export anywhere near as much as they might if they had access to better services. And what that research shows is that there's not a very strong relationship between the level of barriers to trade in services and the productivity performance of manufacturing industries, but that there is a very strong relationship between the level of services trade restrictions and governance. Right, so if you interact these services trade restrictions with governance indicators, then you find a very strong and statistically significant effect. Right, so what that means is if you have high barriers to trade in services and you have bad governance and you lower those barriers to trade in services, you're not going to have much of a positive effect. Right, so there is a very strong dependence on improving governance. And what that means, one of the implications is, if we're thinking about using regional cooperation, regional integration to foster more diversification, as Kathy was arguing, we really need to also focus on this governance dimension. And the big $64 million question, of course, is how can you actually design regional cooperation types of initiatives to do that? Now, if you read most text of free trade agreements, they don't pay a whole lot of attention to governance, right? So I think this is a big gap. I think it's also a big research challenge in terms of how do you actually design these things, and I'll say a little bit about those in my remaining few minutes. So basically what we're talking about here in terms of trying to induce more economic activity diversification is we have to lower these trade costs, include a focus on governance, and the problem here is that many, many things can matter, right? So the real challenge is how do you identify the sets of bundles of issues that really need to be addressed to actually encourage investment in particular types of sectors or particular supply chain types of activities. And here, there's what I would call a silo problem, in that we have different parts of government that actually focus on different types of issues, right? So we have customs valuation, we have import licensing, we have standards, we have people who regulate services, but all of those things together need to be addressed quite frequently in order to encourage investment in productive activities. And of course, as Raad also mentioned, there's a huge political economy dimension to all of this because many of those policies are essentially, as he would argue, political, and it's really about what those things do is they create rents that people will like to keep. Now, one of the implications I would draw from the recent literature and the analysis and the experience, and I would agree completely with Raad, is that this top-down formal integration types of initiatives really are not going to be sufficient to lower trade costs, including the governance dimension, right? They may or may not be necessary, and I think that's a debate we can have. I think they are quite useful in terms of being a focal point for discussion, but we need to do more, in large part because the barriers today are of a non-tariff nature, they're of a regulatory nature, and that really is a different beast, a different set of issues arise in terms of reducing the incidence of those barriers. So I think, and again, to echo what Raad said, you really need to bring the private sector into this more, and I think you really need to start thinking much more about things that happen at the sub-regional level, projects where you can actually identify where people have joint interests. So I would argue we really need to revisit this linear textbook model of regional integration. Of course, the vision remains an Arab common market, so if you read the Arab League statements, that's where leaders say they want to go. I think that can be a useful instrument to actually have discussions with each other, but I would argue you really need to have much more of a focus on what I've called here variable geometry and club-based type of cooperation that involves different levels of government, different actors, almost always the private sector, and people who actually have a stake in improving a particular activity. So the customs union, common market, economic union, the economic integration path that André Sapir sketched out in the first day is certainly not the only way forward, right? And I think it's important to recognize that that is the choice that was made in the European Union, but it's not necessarily going to be the solution to dealing with the governance, trade cost related problems that confront traders and producers in this region. Free trade areas can be deepened to address specific types of problems of a governance nature. And the other thing I would stress that in my mind has made this distinction between free trade areas and the economic integration path that André sketched out somewhat less relevant is that average tariffs today are much, much lower than they used to be. So in a world where we have high tariffs, clearly getting to a customs union is complicated because you have a big redistributional dimensions to this. But I think if we are in a world where tariffs are much lower, if we can actually get rid of those tariffs, then you can actually start dealing with the things that actually do matter from a performance point of view in terms of dealing with these NTBs, dealing with the regulatory types of issues. The countries that have done very well in terms of supply chain participation and creating manufacturing activities and employment don't have tariffs, right? So essentially imports are duty-free, they're processed, they're re-exported. So in that sense, the tariff dimension, which is really front and center in this sequence of economic integration, I would argue, has become much less salient and relevant. I think the other thing I would stress is that much really can be done outside the framework of trade agreements altogether. And if you look at where cooperation actually takes place in the world today, I've been doing a lot of work on the transatlantic dimension, regulators actually do a lot to cooperate internationally. So there's a lot of regulatory cooperation that goes on at the product, at the sector level, that has nothing to do with trade agreements. And I think we, as kind of economists, need to have much better understanding of how that cooperation actually works, what the necessary conditions for it are, and how we can stimulate more of that in this region. So on the slide, I've just had a number of examples, in addition to this regulatory sector-specific types of cooperation, which there is a lot of, and we can come back to that in the discussion period, focusing on everything to do with e-commerce and e-payments, the trade facilitation agenda that has been mentioned by Raed, which again is private-public partnership types of activities, sharing of data, right? So in addition to exchanging staff, just doing a lot more that can be done, given that we have the technologies today. For example, e-procurement, kind of having common databases where you can actually advertise opportunities, but also monitor who gets contracts and so forth, just basically increasing transparency. Those are all kind of possible ways of cooperating. So I would argue we need mechanisms to support what I've called here win-win cooperation, which explicitly recognizes these sovereignty and patronage dynamics and constraints that Raed spoke about, and which are realities, and which we cannot just ignore. So I think focusing on realizing these very specific cross-border, sub-regional types of economic projects, where it's clear who has a stake in the execution of those projects. Raed mentioned a number of them. I think we heard others in earlier sessions. That is the way forward, I would argue. It's not going to be the solution, but at least that's one way of actually creating some positive dynamism in terms of regional cooperation. I think the real challenge is how do you identify those opportunities? And I think here we collectively as a research community really haven't been particularly useful. Right? And I think part of the issue here is how do you design mechanisms to actually identify where there are those opportunities? And that requires deliberative processes. It requires public-private partnerships. It certainly requires an interest and a willingness of the private sector to engage in identifying where there are specific constraints that constrain investments that they would otherwise potentially undertake. And the trick here is to link stakeholders on both sides of a border, right? So clearly all of this applies inside a particular country and is actually being done by different countries around the world. But I think if we're talking about regional cooperation, we're talking about cross-border types of agendas, you need to link stakeholders on both sides of the border. And that requires sharing information on what the problems actually are, coming up jointly with potential solutions, defining an action agenda to deal with those, and very importantly, to monitor implementation and impacts. And here again, I think there's a huge opportunity to actually engage with firms because the firms actually know what the constraints are and what is going on. So they actually have the data that is needed to establish a baseline so that governments, but more importantly, the stakeholders involved in these particular activities can actually monitor and analyze performance over time. Now, if you look at the waterfront of regional cooperation over the last decade or so around the world, the most successful examples have actually pursued this type of an approach. So in East Africa, we have very specific efforts to actually establish road corridors that connect landlocked countries to coastal countries. And instead of saying, we're going to try and solve everything and do it through regional integration, we're actually going to work with the communities that have an interest in making those corridors work with the traders, the shippers, the logistics providers, but also bring in the regulators, the customs officials, and so forth, to actually deal with that specific agenda. And that has actually been successful, right? So in the East Africa community case, I think that is one example of success where trade costs have fallen dramatically. The time it takes to actually ship containers has dropped by a huge percentage. There are also other models. The Pacific Alliance is one in Latin America, where essentially leaders of a small group of countries have said, forget about these treaties, forget about secretariats, forget about all this complicated integration procedures. Let's sit around the table and identify where we have concrete opportunities to cooperate to actually achieve our own objectives. Right? And again, I think that's something to study, to learn from. What do we take away from that? Is that something we can do in this region? So, in short, there's a huge research challenge here, I think, and given that we are mostly all researchers, in terms of identifying where regional cooperation is actually needed to realize those specific opportunities, as opposed to things that are really mostly a domestic agenda, right? So I think that's one way of trying to bifurcate the issues, and I think really focus on these non-tariff measure type of constraints. I think we also then need research to actually identify where cooperation is what I've called here Pareto sanctioned, right? Both sides or all sides that are involved in a particular activity have to benefit from that particular initiative. So that requires ex-ante analysis of what the benefits and costs are of pursuing a particular path and what the distribution of those benefits and costs are, because that really in practice is quite frequently the area in which regional cooperation fails, because people disagree about the distribution of those costs and benefits and the incidence. So who pays, who benefits, and so forth. So making that transparent and trying to deal with that up front, I think, is very important, including identify where there are weak links, right? So where a particular agent who has to play a role doesn't have the resources to do that, so that we can try and identify how you can actually deal with those very practical problems. Here also there's a big question as to what you should make into a legally binding contract, put into a treaty, as opposed to what really can be done through cooperation, through what the lawyers would call soft law type mechanisms. And again, I think I can't stress enough the importance of being concrete. So establishing particular problems, particular goals, and being able to measure progress in dealing with those things. And quite frequently, that is going to require trusted intermediaries, because the private sector doesn't trust the government doesn't trust the private sector. So here again, there is a role to be played by research institutes, by think tanks, but we need to also recognize this lack of trust and the need for trusted intermediaries. So in short, and I'll finish with this slide, I think we need to be much more creative, and here I would fully agree with Raed, in pursuing variable geometry as opposed to relying only on this top-down approach of regional integration. And here we have to also recognize, and it's not a problem in itself, is that incentives are going to differ very much depending on where countries are located, right? So for countries like Tunisia and Morocco, there is no way and no reason and no rationale for them to ignore the European Union, right? That's the big market. For the UAE, that is much less the case. They are much more focused towards the rest of the world, towards Asia. So I think this heterogeneity has to be recognized, and I think trying to push regional integration, that it all has to be a collective, is essentially pushing on a string and is not going to be particularly productive. I think the big challenge is focusing not just on increasing access to markets and getting rid of these barriers to trade, but really to improve governance. And I think this is one area where certainly we, speaking as a trade economist, really haven't done a whole lot of, we haven't been particularly useful, I think, in actually identifying how you can use trade agreements to deal with governance constraints. But I think in particular, how we can actually use sub-regional cooperation to address these types of issues. I've talked about the need to analyze and reflect on experiences and innovations in other regions. Final point here in terms of this outside dimension, which actually goes back to my first slide. In terms of the context, I think it's also important to continue to think about how you actually connect to major initiatives that are going on in the rest of the world. The one that I think that is particularly relevant here is what China is trying to do with the One Belt, One Road initiative in terms of connecting China to Europe, also to some extent Africa. So I think we need to think about that context of how specific countries are going to be connecting to these types of initiatives and what that implies for other countries in the region. And then finally, and it's only been mentioned very briefly, but I think certainly for those countries that are heavily integrated into the European Union, we really need to also kind of rethink and reflect upon the experience that has been had with the deep and comprehensive free trade agreements that the European Union has been trying to negotiate with countries along the Mediterranean, which has not exactly been a big success. But I think here again, the types of issues that I've talked about really need to be centered much more frontally on that agenda in order to help actually move the process of deeper integration forward. So again, these are all kind of research questions to which I don't really have answers, but I think there really is a big agenda here. But again, I would fully support Raed in saying we need less top-down and more bottom-up in terms of being creative to actually exploit regional cooperation opportunities. Thank you.